On March 3rd, 1915, a two-paragraph writer to the Naval Appropriations Act created a new federal agency with a staff of 12 and a budget of $5,000. And then a June 1917 edition of the New York Sun wrote, so far as the average American was concerned, it was promptly forgotten. I would imagine not 1 in 1,000 Americans has ever heard of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, more or less is familiar with their body of work. But that is too bad, because they had an outsized effect on American history, played a critical role in the Allied victory in the Second World War, and shepherded America into the jet age. The history of the NACA deserves to be remembered.
In less than a decade, the United States went from first in flight with the Wright brothers' flights in 1903 to lagging behind our European peers. The idea of a National Center for Aeronautical Research was proposed at least as early as 1911 by the American Aeronautical Society. In 1912, President Taft appointed a commission to study the creation of a National Aerodynamic Laboratory. The commission was headed by Robert Woodard, a well-regarded civil engineer, physicist, and mathematician, and president of the Carnegie Institute of Washington. But the effort failed to get an enabling act to create the laboratory through Congress. One argument to explain the lagging behind in the development of aircraft that has been frequently made is that it was the Wright brothers defending their 1906 patent that had the result of both distracting the industry and disincentivizing production. There were certainly patent disputes, but that is hardly the only reason. A rather more compelling explanation can be found in a congressional study whose results were reported in a hearing before the House Committee on Military Affairs in 1913. Between 1908 and 1913, Germany led the world in government expenditures on aviation at $28 million equivalent. In the same year, the U.S. had spent $435,000 for all federal support of flight-related activity, putting our spending 13th in the world, behind that of Chile and Greece. The U.S. is simply not yet sold on the concept in an era when aeronautical adventures made the news for accidents as much as for accomplishments. While the U.S. Secretary of War had requested a $500,000 appropriation for the Army Aeronautical Division in 1908, Congress had approved none. In fact, no money was appropriated between 1908 and 1911. What was there was funded by small surpluses from other War Department accounts. Well, $125,000 was appropriated for 1912 and another $100,000 for 1913. By 1913, the entire U.S. Army Aeronautical Division included just 10 aviators and 15 aircraft. And while the military was having difficulty convincing Congress of the problem, one person who did recognize it was Charles Doolittle Walcott, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. In 1913, Walcott funded a fact-finding tour overseas, sending a physicist and an aeronautical engineer. There, they established contacts with European counterparts, which would be important later. Came back in 1914 with a damning report on the disparity of investment in aeronautics between the United States and European nations. The outbreak of war in 1914 demonstrated the imperative, but offered a new challenge, as President Wilson and national sentiment was to stay out of the war, thus making any military expenditure suspect and perceived as a potential threat to U.S. neutrality. Walcott, with the credibility of the Smithsonian behind him, was able to convince congressional leaders to include funds for an aeronautical research organization in the 1915 Naval Appropriations Act. The legislation was just 2 short paragraphs. The budget was just $5,000. But the organization thus created, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, or NACA, would eventually play a vital role in U.S. aircraft development, particularly during the Second World War.
In an odd twist, Walcott himself was neither a physicist nor an aeronautical engineer. The man who would play such a critical role in the creation of the organization that so advanced American aviation was a paleontologist.
The purpose of the committee was, according to the legislation, to supervise and direct the scientific study of the problems of flight, with a view to their practical solutions. The committee represented a panel of 12 people, all unpaid. 2 would come from the War Department, 2 from the Navy Department, and 1 each from the Smithsonian, officially a trust instrumentality of the United States, the Weather Bureau, and the Bureau of Standards, plus 5 more members acquainted with aeronautics. The full committee would meet semi-annually, but an executive committee of 7 members would generally keep track of aeronautical problems for the committee to address. The first chairman of the committee was Brigadier General George P. Scriven, Chief Signal Officer of the Army. Walcott represented the Smithsonian Institute and was the chairman of the executive committee. The original 5 members acquainted with aeronautics were all university professors, among them a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University named Joseph Sweetman Ames. While the enabling legislation was a political compromise slipped into a naval bill, the public expectations of the committee were high. A headline in the April 23, 1915 edition of the Washington, D.C. Evening Star reported on the first meeting of the committee. It read, "Problems in flying soon to be tackled." It seems a big order, as the budget for the NACA for the first 5 years was just $5,000 annually.
Well, Walcott's original idea was to create a national laboratory to study aeronautical science. That would have to wait. The committee was not expected to do any actual research. They were expected to coordinate and prioritize research that would presumably be done at universities and military facilities.
But the scope of the problems in flying proved far greater than anticipated, especially as Europe had already moved into war. The New York Sun wrote in April 1917, provision for the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was made in the Naval Appropriations Bill passed March 3, 1915. At the time, there was no adequate conception of the work which would ultimately have to be done by this committee, just as there was no adequate conception of the tremendous part which aeronautics was to play in the European War, less than a year old, and all subsequent warfare. As the U.S. entered the war that it had sought to avoid, the Sun notes how the role of the committee had grown. Now, however, it is launched on a campaign of work which is not only of vital importance for war, but which will be far-reaching in its influence long after the present struggle is over. The task before the small, virtually unfunded committee was enormous. Despite the huge manufacturing capacity of the nation at the outbreak of war, only one large factory, the Curtiss factory in Buffalo, New York, was producing aircraft. Most aircraft produced in the United States were built slowly, in small numbers, in small shops. The U.S. military had few aeronautics training schools, and even fewer trained pilots. And you might see the committee as having failed in the campaign that the Sun had touted. During the Great War, with the exception of some Curtiss-Wright seaplanes used for submarine patrol, U.S. flyers flew planes designed and built in Europe. And despite robust enlistment, only a handful of American-trained flyers arrived in Europe in time to join the fight. But the U.S. participation in the war was brief, less than 20 months from the declaration of war to the end of the war. The extent of the U.S. mobilization was actually impressive, astounding even. Our mobilization certainly occurred more quickly than the Central Powers had planned, but there are limits to how far you can develop military aviation, essentially from scratch, in 20 months. Still, the committee did important work, coordinated research on wireless communication for aircraft, coordinated tests of airplane propellers, tested and established standards for aircraft engines and parts. They advocated for the creation of more military training facilities and coordinated the return of American officers who were serving in foreign militaries to train new pilots. Although possibly the most significant contribution during the Great War was mediating patent disputes between the Glenn Curtiss and the Wright-Martin companies, negotiating a cross-licensing agreement that consolidated patents. The compromise not only sped aircraft production, but did so without the requirement that the government condemn any patents, which would have negatively impacted innovation.
They might not have been able to train a lot of pilots in time to fight in the war, but they did train a lot of pilots, and that would have a large impact on aviation in America after the war. The efforts of the committee meant not only that the United States was much better prepared for the next war, but also on a much more robust path for the development of civil aviation.
While the board was involved in a dizzying array of projects, they had not lost sight of the original goal of creating a national aeronautics research center, including an experimental field and laboratory, something the board called for in its first report in 1915. Congress finally agreed to the appropriation, and the NACA chose a site near Washington, D.C., in Elizabeth City County. Ground was broken on the new facility in 1917. At the urging of Walcott, the new facility was named after Samuel Pierpont Langley, an aviation pioneer who had preceded Walcott as director of the Smithsonian Institution. The then titled Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory, now the Langley Research Center, was dedicated in June 1920 and had a staff of 11. The new laboratory included the first of what would become a hallmark of NACA research, a wind tunnel. The first was small and outdated, but by 1931 the facility was operating multiple tunnels, including the largest wind tunnel in the world, capable of testing full-sized aircraft and eventually spacecraft. Work largely done at Langley in the post-war era established the NACA as one of the premier aeronautical research organizations in the world, and the facility at Langley attracted engineers from all over the country. One of their most significant contributions of the interwar era was the NACA cowling. Radial engines were generally seen as the most efficient for propeller-driven aircraft, but they were air-cooled. Conventional wisdom was that they had to be left essentially open in order to get the airflow needed to cool them, but that created significant drag. The question brought to the NACA was, could a radial engine be made more aerodynamic while still getting sufficient airflow for cooling? Developed by NACA engineer Frank Weick, the cowling reduced the drag of air-cooled radial engines. The design redirects and accelerates differential airflow in much the same way that a wing produces lift, but directs the airflow so that it produces thrust, reducing drag by around 60%. By redirecting the air over the cylinder heads, the cowling actually improved engine cooling while increasing the top speed of aircraft tested by an astonishing 16%. In 1929, flyer Frank Hawks broke the Los Angeles to New York nonstop speed record with a time of 18 hours and 13 minutes in a Lockheed Air Express equipped with the NACA cowling. Officials at Lockheed insisted that the record would not have been possible without the cowling. The design was a breakthrough. The NACA estimated that the possible fuel savings alone from industry adoption of the cowling would have saved millions of dollars more than the entire appropriations that had ever been made for the NACA since its inception. The attention gained by the discovery was a victory for the NACA, and perhaps more importantly, Auburn University history professor James Hansen noted in a 1998 NASA publication From Engineering Science to Big Science for the methodology of engineering research. The NACA cowling changed aviation. After its invention, a version was used on virtually every radial engine aircraft, including those that powered the great bomber fleets of the Second World War. But it really changed the Edison version of invention as a matter of inspiration to one of rigorous testing and experiment. In brief, while the nature of the accomplishment might have been somewhat misunderstood and in some ways deliberately oversold, at the time it sold stakeholders, particularly Congress, on the NACA and its laboratory model. Meanwhile, the committee was instrumental in coordinating assistance among governmental agencies to ensure the success of airmail by the post office, coordinated with the Weather Bureau to establish stations for measuring atmospheric phenomenon, and developing plans to prepare for the military a reserve aerial program which would make them better prepared in case of another war. Langley ran full-scale flight tests, and in doing so established guidelines and procedures for such tests and pioneered processes for training test pilots. Experiments using the NACA wind tunnels improved propeller design, aircraft aerodynamics, and improved the value of retractable landing gear. The NACA demonstrated that the placement for multi-engine aircraft was more efficient when incorporated into the wing structure, an important part of the design of the large multi-engine commercial aircraft of the interwar era, as well as the multi-engine bombers of the Second World War. They developed a numerical system that allowed a standardized understanding of airfoils and developed the laminar flow airfoil, which reduced drag. The system is still used in the design of airfoils, wings, of modern aircraft. As the 1930s progressed, it became clear to NACA people watching Europe that European nations, particularly Germany and Italy, were making increased commitments to aeronautical research, and that much of that effort was focused on military aircraft development. It became obvious that the NACA would have to expand its facilities. The Navy advocated for a facility on the West Coast near the growing aircraft industry in California. A new laboratory was authorized at an airfield near Sunnyvale, California called Moffett Field. Originally built as a naval air station as the home of the base for the rigid airship USS Macon, but was then under the jurisdiction of the Army. They named the new facility after Joseph Ames, who had replaced Charles Walcott as director of the NACA in 1927. The Ames Research Center opened in 1939. An additional aircraft engine research facility was opened near Cleveland, a center of manufacturing. So how important was the NACA to the war? Well, for example, the laminar wing was a key design element that allowed for the notable agility of the North American P-51 Mustang, considered one of the best fighter aircraft of the war. According to history professor Roger E. Bilston, writing in the third edition of the NASA History Series Orders of Magnitude, a history of the NACA and NASA, when the Boeing Model 299, the prototype for the B-17, performance exceeded expectations, Boeing sent a letter of appreciation to the NACA for its contributions to the plane's flaps, airfoil, and engine cowlings. The letter wrote, "It appears your organization can claim a considerable share in the success of this particular design." In particular, manufacturers faced difficulty with engine performance at high altitudes. The NACA developed standards and testing methods that allowed the development of superchargers. Nearly every U.S. military aviation power plant of the war utilized the results of this research in forced induction systems that gave U.S. planes a performance advantage over 15,000 feet that their Axis adversaries never matched. The NACA wind tunnels proved exceptionally useful for finding design elements that disrupted airflow, allowing manufacturers to clean up designs in ways that improved efficiency and performance. That service was performed on the prototypes of the Grumman F-4 Wildcat, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. When the Lockheed P-38 Lightning demonstrated problems with loss of control during high-speed dives, NACA wind tunnel experiments identified the reason and led to the development of dive flaps that were then incorporated into numerous aircraft designs, saving pilots' lives. This research would prove critical later in understanding forces at transonic speeds. Wind tunnel testing of larger planes was done with models. The NACA wind tunnels were used in the design of the Boeing B-29. NACA testing determined the most survivable ways for airplanes to ditch in the ocean, again saving lives and developing procedures still relevant today. A January 1944 editorial in the journal Aviation stated, "How much is it worth to this country to make sure that we don't find the Luftwaffe our superiors when we start the second front? We spend in one night over Berlin more than $20 million. The NACA requires now $17,546,700 for this year's work. These raids are prime factors in winning the war. How can we do more towards victory than by spending the price of one air raid in research that will keep our air forces in the position which the NACA has made possible?" How powerful was the effect of the NACA on the war? It would be impractical to try to list all the projects, not to mention the efforts to coordinate aeronautical research, design, and development in which the NACA was involved over the war years. But in a simple sense, NACA efforts gave the Allied advantages in military aeronautics that the Axis was never able to match. Certainly some of the most significant military aircraft designs fielded by the United States during the war were significantly improved due to the efforts of the NACA. Even the Trinity Project owes its debt to the NACA, as the planes to which the NACA made such a significant contribution were the only means at the time to deliver the product of their work. The role played in the war was represented in the growth of the agency. In 1938, the Langley staff was 429. In 1945, it was more than 3,000. After the war, the NACA was the agency in charge of testing and development of the Bell X-1 and helped to develop the X-15. NACA research on the aerodynamic forces encountered during transonic flight and supersonic flight provided the fundamental design rules that were applied to the early U.S. military jet aircraft, such as the Convair F-102 Delta Dagger and the Grumman F-11 Tiger and the B-58 Hustler. These design rules, the Whitcomb Area Rule, named after NACA engineer Richard Whitcomb, and the Supersonic Area Rule, developed by NACA engineer Robert T. Jones, both of which regard drag and efficiency, are critical elements used in the design of virtually all high-performance aircraft today.
In 1958, after the Soviet launch of Sputnik, the United States decided that they needed to consolidate all their aeronautical research and rocketry programs into a single civilian agency. When NASA was created in 1958, they absorbed all the facilities and the 8,000 employees of the NACA. It is fair to say that the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was the foundation upon which the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was founded. And NASA continues the mission of the NACA today, still a major contributor to the development of aeronautical science and aviation technology, because after all, the A in NASA stands for aeronautics. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguideguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.